I'm going to introduce our guest, Seth Schindler, who's the author of Sowing the Seeds of Change. And he's an anthropologist, and he's worked as a curator at the Arizona State Museum, an NEH Research Fellow, and a Weatherhead resident scholar at the School for Advanced Research. Something tells me that there's a lot more to that brief biography, Seth, but we really appreciate having you here with us today. And I'm going to get your PowerPoint up and running, and we'll get going. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Well, the title of my talk today, Sowing the Seeds of Change, is also the title of this new book that's coming out, published by the University of Arizona Press. As Scott said, I have an advanced copy for anybody to look at after the talk. This is the first book published about a food bank in the United States. Excuse me. Why a book about a food bank? Well, the community food bank is no ordinary food bank. It's one of the oldest, largest, most respected, and innovative in the United States. I didn't know any of this when I first began this project about 5 years ago, and perhaps few in the audience know this about the food bank other than donating food in an annual food drive, which was the extent of my experience. I answered a request for help by the food bank. They were looking for a researcher to help them with what they called their history project. This was about 5 years ago. And so I went to the headquarters, and they told me about their project and that they had gathered together old photos. They had a couple of books of these photos taken by individuals in the early days. And then they also had annual reports, minutes of meetings. But that was about all they had, and it really didn't tell me much. They told me that perhaps I could help them put together a page or two about their history on their website. And after I looked at the material, I decided I needed much more to do anything really, and I decided to start interviewing participants at the food bank, both in the past and presently. And then I decided to visit some of their sites, their operations, get a better feel for what was going on. I did get the feeling that this was a much bigger story. And what also prompted my interest in perhaps doing a book was what I learned about the scale of the problem of hunger in the world, the United States, and in Arizona. This doesn't seem to be working. There we go. There are over 800 million people in the world who don't get enough to eat. The term food insecurity is used to describe these people who have to skip meals, eat less at meals, buy cheap, non-nutritious food, or decide to feed their children and not themselves. See if you can advance. There we go. In the United States, there are over 35 million food insecure people. In the last couple of years during the pandemic, this has risen to over 50 million. You'll see most of them are concentrated in the southern part of the United States, the Sun Belt, including Arizona. In Arizona, the problem is no less shocking. There are over 200,000 food insecure people in southern Arizona. This means 1 in 6 of its residents and 1 in 4 children. The question I had to ask is how this could be true in perhaps the richest country in the world. It's a paradox, and one that I'm not sure my research answered successfully, but I'm not sure anybody has. On the left, we see a familiar picture from the Great Depression, a bread line. On the right is a recent picture of the food line at the community food bank. The problem of food insecurity wasn't really recognized by our government till the 1960s, when President Kennedy toured the impoverished areas of the South, which led him to initiate a pilot food stamp program. A few years later, President Johnson made it permanent as part of his war on poverty. The community food bank grew out of the efforts of a grassroots hunger advocacy group, the Food Action Coalition of Tucson, in the mid-1970s. 3 of its participants founded the community food bank in 1976. Mark Homan, Barry Corey, and Dan Duncan. On the left is the food bank's first headquarters on South 4th. The building is still there. It was about a 600 square foot unheated warehouse. They had no refrigerator even. You can see that little van on the left of the building. That was a refrigerated van where they kept their produce. They had an ambitious goal to end hunger in Tucson. They felt, like many, that the food stamp program was managed poorly. And they were alarmed by the amount of fresh produce that was going to waste in the city. On the right is the headquarters of the food bank today. It's about 100,000 square feet. A lot has changed, but as we saw in the previous picture, comparing the Great Depression line with that at the food bank today, some things haven't. The food bank in 1976 with 1 employee. On the left, Dan Duncan, and Mark Homan on the right with his daughter. You can see the heavy winter coat. This was January. There was no heat. They had a few boxes of donated food. On the left is their first volunteer, Arnie Salverson, and that was the first delivery truck. Their idea was to have the food distribution done in a centralized fashion to work through nonprofit agencies, both faith-based and otherwise, who are already serving the poor in Tucson. They also believe they could make it as easy for supermarkets and other food distributors to save their surplus food as to throw it out. The emergency food boxes that they provided had basic staples, enough for 3 days. This was their rallying cry. Hunger does hurt. Make the ache go away, give to the community food bank. It was effective, and the results in the first year of operation were really amazing, considering who was doing this work. They distributed over 10,000 emergency food boxes and 80,000 pounds of salvaged food. In 2 years, this had grown to 23,000 boxes and 400,000 pounds. 120 local agencies participated in the distribution. How did they do this? Food drives became the basic method. On the left is a picture of the first University of Arizona sponsored food drive in 1976. On the right is the letter carriers food drive from that year. Both organizations, through the years, have contributed greatly to the food bank's success. My only involvement prior to this project was in donating food through the letter carriers food drive. The founders discovered that the need was much greater than they had anticipated, much, much greater. It wasn't just the homeless and the unemployed, but the underemployed and the working poor. Oops. Here's a list of the founding board members. They came from many segments of the Tucson community, the religious community, businesses, and nonprofits. Interviewing the founders, he talked about why the board was so successful and why the food bank was so successful. There was a great diversity of interests represented here. And for whatever reason, these particular individuals hit it off. There was great debate always, creative solutions. They disagreed on a lot of things, but they always came together to ask this fundamental question: how can we do it better? More often than not, they figured it out. But they had many problems early on. You can imagine what it was like operating out of that primitive warehouse. They had very few people then, very few volunteers. One of the biggest problems was the shortage of donated food in the summer. This illustrates a response to a plea in the Tucson Star asking for help. In my research, I was trying to determine the key factors involved in the food bank's success and what distinguished their culture. They talked about the board, the diversity of opinion. Few organizations succeed long-term without inspirational leadership. This is Charles Punch Woods on the left. I think that's from 1979 and 1980, and toward the end of his career on the right. He was the food bank's charismatic leader for about a quarter century, from 1978 to 2003. I had the opportunity to interview Punch a few times before he passed away recently. And these conversations confirmed what I had heard and read about him. He has had an engaging personality. The people he worked with that I talked to talked about his perseverance, that he never would take a no in response to any inquiry for help. He also had a very folksy sense of humor, great storyteller. Punch was also very good at finding the right people, staff members who shared his passion and his legendary enthusiasm. This is Joy Tucker, who was Punch's right-hand woman for a quarter century, and then for another decade or so after Punch retired. She had many jobs through the years, such as facilities director. Then she became director for a couple of years after Punch retired. In my book, I talk about Punch helping to establish the food bank's culture that I called one of caring, sharing, and innovating. Punch had a background as a lay minister before he came to the food bank. He worked in community development in Mexico. And he believed that his background helped him greatly deal with Tucson's religious community. And he felt that was perhaps the strongest factor in the food bank's early success, that the food bank was accepted in Tucson. In a few years, the demand for the food bank services outgrew the capabilities of its facility in South Tucson, and they moved to a new building on West 27th Street. This one was about 18,000 square feet. Here at this facility, they were able, for the first time, to provide food directly to clients. Previously, it was distributed solely through agencies. In 1983, around the time of this photo, the staff was still pretty small. There were only 7 employees. Yet they were able to serve 80,000 clients at this time. With the help of Congressman Jim Colby, Punch worked for several years to bring the federal commodity supplemental food program to Arizona. It's known here as Food Plus. Food Plus provides qualifying mothers, children, and seniors a monthly package of food. This is in addition to the emergency food boxes I talked about earlier. Here are volunteers at this second warehouse. To meet the increased demand in the 1980s, new fundraising techniques were needed. This is a picture of the 6th annual Hunger 100 bike ride to raise money. Mennonite quilt auctions became an annual event to raise money. The food bank sponsored benefit concerts, such as this one with Harry. Is it Chapin or Chapin? Chapin. For the first time, they also sought government and corporate donations in a systematic way. This is one of the early large donations from a local grocery chain. The success of the food bank was just being recognized, as this headline would indicate. About this time, the food bank joined the national network of food banks, which was then called Second Harvest. Today it's called Feeding America. Punch became a board member on this national organization. They also joined the Arizona Association of Food Banks. In both cases, this helped the food bank improve their methods of acquisition, storage, and distribution. They also began to expand in southern Arizona for the first time. This is the Amato Food Bank. Branches were established in other rural areas, such as Ajo and Marana. As I said in my research, I tried to determine the key factors behind the food bank's success and elements of their culture that made that possible. I've talked about a few already. Egalitarianism is another. And that definitely came out of Punch Woods, who had a great respect for the less fortunate among us. Picture here is Terry Valenzuela, who had been a client. She was disabled. Puncher invited her to become a board member. She served on the board for many years. Her son today now serves on the board. Another key element defining the food bank's success, shown here in the volunteers at the food bank. All nonprofits depend upon volunteers to succeed, but in interviewing several volunteers, it became clear that the food bank's volunteers have an unusual degree of passion and enthusiasm. You see them come from many segments of Tucson society, on the left there from Tucson Electric Power. Long-term loyalty was another thing I discovered as a key element of the food bank's success and its culture. I ran across many staff and volunteers with decades of service. The longest one on the right, Keith Hutton, 35 years work volunteering for the food bank. On the left is Elsa Pratt. She still works at the food bank. She's been there since Punch Woods started. But what about the food bank's clients? If you're going to try to determine what makes success, you have to hear from them, of course. A few years ago, the food bank started a series of publications called Voices, in which the stories of their clients are told. This is one client, Glenn, and I'll read from his story in a Voices publication. For 28 years, I had my own company and was doing well. Then I was disabled and couldn't work. I ended up on the street. I'm so thankful to the food bank. Without their help, I would have starved. And you hear stories like this. And the series of Voices publications is available, and I recommend anybody to take a look. By the mid-1990s, the food bank was distributing annually millions of pounds of food, 25,000 meals per day. Pictured here is the staff from 1996, about 40 people. However successful, I learned that the staff had determined that there was a hidden hunger gap, as they called it. Infants, children, and seniors still were not being adequately served. A few years earlier, they had tried homebound, low-income seniors through the We Caravan program. This was partially successful, but a lot more needed to be done. In 1996, the infant food box and senior brown bag programs were introduced. At the same time, in the mid-90s, the Kids Cafe was launched at a Boys and Girls Club in South Tucson. This became one of the food bank's signature community outreach programs, and it has grown substantially. Hot meals and snacks are given to children 5 to 18 years old at neighborhood centers. They're also provided with nutrition education. This was the first attempt by the food bank to provide information about food and nutrition to clients. This turned out to be a transformational event. This is a note from a kid in their snack pack program, which was another program that was developed about the same time. Food is given to these kids to take home over the weekend. Today, over 62,000 of these snack packs, which are now called backpacks, are distributed. In the 90s, the gleaning program was developed. volunteers collect citrus and vegetables, which otherwise would have gone to waste in orchards and at farms. These are distributed through food boxes to agencies and directly to clients. Jeannie Fox here managed that program. She's another long-term. She just retired, about 30 years of service to the food bank. She managed the gleaning program and then what's called Tucson's Table, which it was called that then. Now it's called Agency Market. That produce, for example, gleaned in the fields is provided through various agencies in Tucson. The 90s were a fertile time for the food bank's expansion through creative programming and promotion. This is an example of calendar produced by kids to raise money. These are still being produced. The food bank sponsored the publication of 2 cookbooks to raise money, Padre Quino's favorite meatloaf and Carradade's favorite trail mix. Food bank sponsored various culinary festivals and holiday share illustrated here, which was an important fundraising and promotional event for many years. The food bank also experimented with its own store, the Value Food Store, where prepared and packaged foods were sold to its clients. This was on the grounds of that multi-service center I showed earlier, and food stamps could be used. Purchase this. I'm using this to illustrate another characteristic of the food bank's culture, a willingness to experiment, to take risks. Didn't work out quite as well as they'd hoped. And eventually they stopped the store. But I have it here to illustrate what it led to. In 1996, the biggest risk the food bank ever took was the purchase of the giant Levy's department store warehouse on South Country Club. This is that 100,000 square foot building. There's 2 floors. It's an enormous warehousing space on the first floor where food distribution and storage takes place. And on the second floor, there are many, many offices. The risk was a financial one. They were taking on an enormous amount of debt. And there was a practical problem because at the time, the food bank could only occupy a small part of this building. But Punch argued strongly to make the acquisition. He was looking into the future. These are the kinds of trucks that replaced that little food delivery van. This is the inside of the warehouse. A few years later, the food bank took its first serious steps in its transformation from a hunger relief organization, a charity really, to one aimed at getting at the heart of the problem of poverty. This is their first demonstration garden on the grounds of the multipurpose center. It's called the Westia Tierra Demonstration Garden. Here, clients were given plots to grow their own vegetables and educated about gardening. At the same time, the food bank began its first farmers market. This was the Tuesdays market, which still exists on the grounds of the multi-service center. This was at a time when farmers markets were just taking hold in Tucson. I'm going to skip ahead to 2015. In my book, there are two parts. Part one has to do with the early history I've just sketched here. It's called Feeding the Hungry of Southern Arizona. The second part is called It Takes More Than Food. And I write about a revolution that began in 2015 at the food bank. Its efforts to transform itself from a charity to one aimed at preventing hunger and poverty, breaking the cycle of poverty that's at the heart of the food insecurity problem. Pictured here is Michael Mcdonald, the CEO of the food bank today, who took over in 2015. I'm going to read from their new mission. We change lives in the communities we serve by feeding the hungry and building a healthy, hunger-free tomorrow. The challenge, gaining equal access to healthy food for our clients. Emphasis on the word healthy. Overcoming serious diet-related diseases such as diabetes. Combating social isolation, which is common among seniors who suffer from food insecurity. Combating the lack of economic opportunity. The strategy is we'll bring together health and food, education, and community development. That this is mission and these strategies are beginning to work is reflected in the fact that in 2018, the Community Food Bank was named Food Bank of the Year by the National Organization of Food Banks Feeding America. In recent years, the Community Food Bank has expanded greatly throughout Southern Arizona. Its service area now covers over 23,000 miles. Apart from Tucson, there are substantial branches now called resource centers in Green Valley, Amato, Marana, Nogales, and Wilcox. Their operating budget has grown from the $7,000 provided by the city originally to annually over 125 million. There are 400 agency partners. 250,000 food boxes are distributed annually to over 200,000 people. The staff has grown to almost 150, and there are over 6,000 volunteers. One of the most important things we've seen is the growing amount of fresh produce distributed. The idea here is to improve the diet of the food bank's clients. It's grown over 500% in the last 50 years to 50 million pounds distributed. The food bank has developed a food sourcing team to accomplish this. Remember, I talked about gleaning earlier? They do it very differently now, and they use the farms of Mexico and the Nogales branch of the food bank to orchestrate this effort. They've had to convince farmers and distributors to allow the food bank to organize the distribution rather than just dumping the food. This enormous quantity of fresh produce is distributed not only in Arizona, but through over 20 states today in Feeding America's network of food banks. The client mix hasn't really changed that much in the last half century. The majority served are still children, seniors, and the working poor. The homeless haven't been forgotten. On the left, we see the daily breakfast that's served at Cross Street Community at the Southside Presbyterian Church. I actually volunteered there. The food bank provides food there. Casa San Juan on the right. They serve recent immigrants. The growth of the food bank in the rural parts of southern Arizona was made possible by the development of the Wilcox Distribution Center in 2015. This is a distinctive drive-through pantry. This is the building, a new 8,000 square foot state-of-the-art warehouse. It serves 27 communities in Graham, Greenlee, and Cochise County. This area, of course, Wilcox is the richest agricultural area in southern Arizona. The town of Tombstone is typical of the communities served by the Wilcox Distribution Center. Here's Ben Johnson, who's the volunteer director at the Tombstone Community Food Bank. Most people think of Tombstone as a tourist mecca, but in fact, half of the people there rely on food boxes. Most are seniors. The Marana Food Bank has grown recently. They now call it a resource center. They added several thousand feet, but not just for the distribution of food boxes. Marana Resource Center has a job resource center with a computer lab. Assistance is given with medical supplies and food stamp applications. Classes are given in cooking, nutrition, GED, and English as a second language. There we go. In recent years, the food bank has increased its efforts to improve the lives of children. In Tucson, here are several schools that have been helped. The food bank has helped install gardens at many schools in the area and give kids hands-on experience. The idea is to have them cultivate the right eating habits that'll pay dividends later in life. Here's a kid at Manzo Elementary School harvesting chard. Remember what I said about 1 in 4 children in Southern Arizona suffering from food insecurity. The food bank also developed another program called Food Safari, where University of Arizona nutrition students go into the schools and teach about developing healthy food habits. Adults also learn about the same thing. This is a picture of a class in gardening and nutrition at the Punchwoods Multi-Service Center. Their garden that's now called the Learning Garden. A few years ago, consistent their efforts toward helping their clients, a farm was developed called Las Milpitas. Clients are given plots to grow their own vegetables. They're given the tools, supplies, and classes are given to them. There are now over 80 such plots at Las Milpitas. School groups visit and are given instruction in what's going on there. There's a camp, summer camp there now for kids. Food Bank has sponsored and installed community gardens throughout the city. This is one at the Quincy Center. Food Bank has also developed a distinctive program called the Ambassador Program. Volunteers are given in-depth training in the new food bank's mission and strategies, and they go out into the community to spread the word. In 2016, 17 ambassadors participating in 50 community events reached thousands of Southern Arizona residents. Food bank also works with local farmers. It helps them make their crops, which are sold to farmers markets and elsewhere, more competitive in the marketplace. This is John Rube, who has participated in that program, and another one called the Farm to Institution program, where fresh produce, organic produce, is sold to schools in the TUSD system and to hospitals such as Tucson Medical Center. The food bank works with various nonprofits in Tucson and Southern Arizona who have compatible missions and strategies. Illustrated here is Desert Harvesters. Desert Harvesters received a grant to develop a resource guide to make better use of arid land foods. In the last few years, over $500,000 has been given by the food bank to various nonprofits in Cochise County. They're called capacity building grants. The money has been used to develop projects such as constructing greenhouses, developing cooking and nutrition classes, diabetic food boxes, and meals for the homeless. Food bank continues to develop its farmers markets, including the one at the Santa Cruz, or the one called the Santa Cruz River Market. Recently, the Farmer's Almanac named the Santa Cruz Market in its list of 10 farmers markets you need to visit. This is a picture of the Tucson Village farm stand at the Santa Cruz Rivers Market. And here is the stand operated by the Rob's family, who specialize in pistachio nuts. They have a farm near Wilcox. This is the Tuesday market on the grounds of the Punchwoods Multi-Service Center. In recognition of the fact that there are gaps in the social services provided its clients, in 2012, the Community Food Bank developed the Gabrielle Giffords Family Assistance Center. Clients are given one-on-one bilingual help obtaining SNAP benefits, food stamp benefits, cash and medical assistance from DES, as well as rent, utility, and prescription drug relief. I talked about the second part of my book. It takes more than food. It certainly takes jobs. We're going to break the cycle of poverty, and it's at the heart of the problem of food insecurity. In 2012, the Community Food Bank established Carradade Community Kitchen. Its 10-week culinary training program gives unemployed and underemployed people the skills needed for careers in the food industry. It has a staff of 15, helped by 300 volunteers. Apart from for the training, Carradade Community Kitchen has become very important in providing meals throughout the community, especially during the pandemic. About 200 students have graduated. 85% have been employed. It takes research. You might remember me talking about the early board asking the question, how can we do it better? Research has become a very important part of today's food bank. For several years, it has worked with different departments at the University of Arizona, for example, the Bureau of Applied Research in the anthropology department has helped the food bank with surveys to determine the effectiveness of its programs. In recent years, the food bank has worked with the Division of Public Health and Nutrition at the university. Research aimed at helping people with diet-related disease. One of the most interesting projects in recent years is called La Doce Barrio Foodways. The community food bank sponsored it with other local organizations. As it reads here, this is a cover from a report that was produced with the results of this study, a report of community knowledge and recommendations for sustainable change in Tucson, Arizona. La Doce Barrio is an old Hispanic neighborhood along South 12th. What makes this study very different than others having to do with community development is that it was carried out by the neighborhood's own residents. Typically, what you found and still find is that local government and commercial interests shape the development of communities. What happened here was very different. Citizen ethnographers, high school students, went out into their own community and interviewed its residents to learn what the residents themselves wanted to see change and how that might be done. They also made a documentary film. You could Google a Doce Barrio Foodways project and you can read the report. I think there may even be a link to the film that I saw. It's very interesting. Obviously, the community food bank has not eradicated hunger in southern Arizona, but we've seen evidence, certainly, of considerable success. How does one measure the success of an organization? It's not just in the numbers, the number of food boxes distributed, for example. I think it's much better to look at how well a community comes together to help each other. Here's a recent hunger walk, bringing together many segments of Tucson's community. Perhaps you can see success best in the smiles of the participants and those who they help. Trying to get this to turn. Yeah. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth. I really appreciate it. And we have a question in the room here. Let me get a microphone for you. There you go.
One of the sad commentaries is that military personnel have had to go to food banks because they've had insufficient food through their military organization.
I never heard that.
Oh, yeah. Personally, I find it disgusting, but it's happened here commonly.
That's very interesting. I wish I had known that before I wrote the book. Maybe the second edition.
The camera started following me for some reason,
Okay.
Seth. So we're gonna just stay right there, and I'm gonna trick the camera. Hopefully. So Seth, I really appreciate the presentation, and the Ollie U of A has participated in the community food bank program. We've had a couple great volunteers, Jody Mole and Lloyd, who help bring our members down there and help out periodically. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, we haven't been able to do so. But if you haven't been to the food bank to see that facility, it is just drops your jaw to see this warehouse that's like, feels like 10 Costco's in size. And it's
almost as big as Amazon
it's quite alarming.
workshops. Yeah.
It's quite alarming, but we hope to get back to volunteering and helping with that. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to how they've adapted during the pandemic. And
Well, I have a chapter in the book on exactly that, and I went out to visit the sites. They had to move to the Keno Sports Park, and they did a drive-through pantry. The problem was they couldn't use a lot of their own volunteers for health reasons, and they depended upon city employees, the National Guard, and actually I have a few pictures in the book of that happening. Their farmers markets changed to drive-through pantries too. The amount of food distributed during the pandemic increased, I don't know, 30, 40%. And somehow they pulled it off.
we have a question from our audience, Bruce Kaplan, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Seth, thank you very much. This has been very interesting, and I hope people that aren't familiar with the food bank benefit from your presentation and your book. In 1977, my father started a program at his small local business for voluntary employee payroll deductions to benefit the food bank. And that went through at least the late 80s when the business was sold. So I'm curious to know if programs like that still exist. There's still small businesses that contribute to the functioning of the
Small
food bank.
businesses, I don't know if they follow the model that you're talking about. You're talking about your father's business in Tucson?
Yes.
Yeah, I was unfamiliar with that. I learn something every day because there's so many people who have been involved with the food bank as volunteers. And you think of 400 different agencies in Southern Arizona who are involved, and then all the people who work for them. You run into new stories all the time.
I think one of the big benefits we have in this state is the charitable tax deduction that, especially for people thinking about year-end giving right now, but it's actually a tax credit, excuse me, not a deduction that you get. And I know that the food bank is a qualifying group and something to consider as well, because it comes right off your taxes and helps great organizations like this as well.
Yes.
I have a couple questions. Is that, I've never been out to your facility yet. It's on South Country Club. Is that like north of the freeway, or how far south is it?
Well, it's off of 29th.
Okay. And if somebody
If you
needs
take-
help. Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I usually take the Palo Verde overpass and get off of 29th. It's not a quasi-industrial
Mm-hmm.
area. Or you can take Keno to 29th and go east to South Country Club.
It's not
So-
You
that,
can't miss it. It's
Yeah.
enormous.
So
building.
if people want help from this, do they have to go out to that building? I mean, I
Not
see you
necessarily.
have
they
all these
can.
other programs. That's amazing, actually.
People can still
Mhm.
receive
Mhm.
food boxes through other local
Mm-hmm.
agencies, but they can go directly to this headquarters that we're talking about.
So if you go to your farmer's market on the Santa Cruz River, what's the difference in that market and say another farmer's market in the area? I mean, do people go there that need free food at that market, or how does
A
that
lot of
work?
clients go there because they
Mhm.
have a special, I think it's called the Double Up SNAP or food stamp program, where their clients can get, or other people in need can get twice as much for their money.
Hmm.
I don't believe that's available, for example, other farmers markets.
are there any other questions from the audience here? Well, and any other questions from the remote audience? Well, I do again want to thank Seth so much for your work in this book and bringing to light this organization, because I think very few people even understand the depth. We have a question here. Sorry, 1 second.
Scott, is it possible to take a tour now of the food bank?
Yeah, has reopened.
Okay,
They've reorganized, redesigned certain things since I finished writing my book. But you can walk
so,
right in.
oh, you don't have to call for an appointment?
If you want a real tour, you should. They have a community engagement office, handles volunteers and others. And they'll set you up for a tour of the main facility. Sure.
Okay, thank you. And another question, I used to know a gentleman who worked he was a cook at the Veterans Administration, Veterans Hospital. And he used to shop at the community food bank. Do they no longer have that store where they do that?
I talked about a store from the early days, the value food store. They don't have that anymore.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Ron?
What's the current estimate of food waste or food that is not utilized in the Tucson?
Yeah, I don't know the exact figures, but it's still shockingly high, even though Community Food Bank has made considerable efforts to salvage as much as they can. They're doing a great job, as I said, with the produce that was going to waste coming up from Mexico, but it's something to look into as far as Tucson. The other problem is that the supermarkets and other wholesalers have become increasingly efficient in not wasting foods for their own economic reasons, which has left, at least locally, less food to be salvaged. It might explain the heavy reliance on the Mexican farm market.
How much food purchasing are they actually having to do?
Well, during the pandemic, they had to do a hell of a lot of purchasing because people weren't donating. They weren't going out, and the food bank couldn't hold its regular food drives. So they, through donations and government grants, I'd say the majority of the food was actually purchased. So with this actually the budget went up to 150 million the last couple of years.
It's a pretty amazing figure. I think you said about 200,000 people they serve.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about our population, Tucson's over 1 million, I guess,
Yeah.
and you got Southern Arizona, but
I said it was 1 in 6. And I think it was 1 in 5 during the pandemic in Southern Arizona.
So for someone to get food from you at any of these sources, do they have to like say that they're on a federal food stamp program?
The
or can it-
emergency food program is available to just about anybody. You don't have to qualify. Remember, I
Okay.
talked about the Food Plus?
Mm.
That you need to show some documentation that you're in need. But if you were in great need in an emergency situation, you can just go get it. That hasn't changed.
Hmm. So are you getting produce from like Bosch's and Safeway, places like
Yeah, they
that?
still get,
You get
sure.
like their produce when it's out of date or whatever?
Yeah, it's not bad, but
No.
they can't sell it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
well, Will, again, thank you so much for this presentation and for producing this book again, Sowing the Seeds of Change. And it's hot off the press. And
What I think people find most interesting in this book is the results of all the interviewing I did. I decided to make quotes from all these participants in the food bank a major part. And I think that personalizes the history, makes it far more readable too, because as you know, history books aren't usually readable.
well, and we had the benefit of recording this session, and we'll put it out on our Ollie YouTube channel for all to see.
Thank you.
And let you get the word out around the world about this amazing food bank. And it's sort of sad that we have to have something this big and powerful, but it's amazing that we've got it here in Southern Arizona. And thank you for bringing this to light and helping spread the word.